well, it's on our Facebook page, so it's facebook.com/move2amend. Thanks, Tom. I don't need to tell you what to tweet. We're good? Okay. We need to work out the hand motions, because this means nothing to me. It's the signal. Okay. All right, welcome everybody, and welcome to the folks who are joining us online as well. My name is Caitlin Sabosi-Belknap. I'm Move to Amend's National Director, and we're here at Move to Amend's National Leadership Summit in Washington, D.C., and we've just gone through 2 pretty intensive days, and we still have 2 more to go, so this is the halfway mark, basically. And we're here tonight to talk about why we need to abolish corporate personhood to save democracy and our planet, and we have 2 both movement superstars, but also really good friends of Move to Amend, who are here. And when we were thinking about who to bring, we thought, well, who better than our absolute favorite media personality and our absolute favorite attorney that exists in the world. So that's who you're going to get to hear from. Thom Hartmann is an author and progressive national and internationally syndicated talk show host whose shows are available in over 500 million homes worldwide. He's the New York Times bestselling 4 times Project Censor award-winning author of 24 books in print in 17 languages on 5 continents, including Unequal Protection, The Rise of Corporate Dominance, and the Theft of Human Rights. I'll just say one more sentence. His radio show, the Thom Hartmann Program, is syndicated on stations nationwide and also on Free Speech TV, which is our partner in this conference and is helping us with this live stream. Also, Thom is someone that has been with this movement since before Move to Amend. How many of you are kind of here because of Thom Hartmann, because you heard about this on Thom Hartmann's show? Yeah, there's probably, if we were to give an award out to the person who has brought the most people to Move to Amend, it would probably have to go to Thom. So thank you for being our #1 cheerleader so far. And Jazmin Gomez is a lawyer, activist, and 2016 to 18 Democracy Fellow for Free Speech for People. She's a graduate of Boston University Law School. Ms. Gomez has served on the Journal of Science and Technology Law and has written about potential state responses to corporate big data surveillance. She held a number of leadership roles at law school, including as co-president of the Latin American Student Association, vice president of the American Constitution Society, co-chair for the first-year advisory program at BU, and networking chair for Outlaw. During her leadership positions, Jasmine has helped create, facilitate, and host at least 30 events at the law school and around the city of Boston. She also received the Emerging Leader Award from the Black Law Students Association. And Jasmine is somebody that we've had the pleasure of working with for the last couple years now on numerous projects, and the leadership that she has provided to this movement around intersectionality and looking at the issue of money and politics and corporate power through the lens of prioritizing communities of color and LGBTQ folks. And so it's a real treat that we have her here tonight, and she'll also be joining us tomorrow as well. So without further ado, I would like to give a big round of applause to these 2 awesome folks. And if you clap too long, we won't get to hear them, so there you go. And so Thom and Jasmine are each going to answer the question why we need to abolish corporate personhood to save democracy and our planet. Then we're going to have a little bit of a discussion around a couple key points as it relates to what they think that is most critical for the U.S. democracy movement to be doing right now, and also what Move to Amend's most effective contributions are to the movement and how we can do our part to be more effective in the movement. We'll have some time for Q&A, and then we'll wrap it up. So Thom is going to go first. And again, thank you, Thom Hartmann.
Thank you. Am I answering that question from this first thing, or am I just...
Yes. Or whatever you end up doing, because you'll have the mic.
That's all. Hello. Great to have you all with us tonight. And I have to say, this organization is near and dear to my heart like no other. And the work that you all are doing is some of the most important work that's being done in this country right now. And I so honor your willingness to be here, your commitment, the time you're putting into this. It is so rare in America that we find people who have that commitment, that passion, that concern, that care, and the willingness to really make this country and this world ultimately work. It's the most important work that's out there, so thank you. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I wanted to start out by telling you a story, and I think that it ties into the answers to both of these two questions. On the way over here, my cab driver was, he was talking, he was told me he was from Nigeria, and he'd lived in the United States about 30 years, and we were coming up from the southwest waterfront, and just an explosion of construction, and he's like, wow, there's an enormous amount of construction going on here. And, and all over the city. And I was like, yeah, it's a boom town in this city. And he says, boy, he says, when I came here in the early 90s, as I recall, he said, it was nothing like this. It was a good town and everything, but it wasn't like growing like a weed. And I said, well, yeah, that was really, before it really sank in that the Supreme Court had legalized in the Buckley decision in '76, among others, had legalized billionaires and giant corporations and even foreigners owning American politicians. Now you can buy a politician. And he said, whoa, that sounds like my country. And I'm like, yeah. And he said, so what's this deal? What's Trump doing now with with this whole trade thing and stuff? And I said, are you talking about him saving 60,000 Chinese jobs with ZTE, the company that has backdoors in their phones so that they can spy on all of us? And the Department of Defense won't allow to be sold on military bases, and because of that, and because of their stealing our technology, the Department of Commerce wanted to shut them down, and that was going to cause them to go out of business. He's like, yeah. And I said, well, turns out that the Chinese government gave Donald Trump's partners in Indonesia, who were building a giant Trump hotel there that was running out of money and was in dire straits, gave them $500 million. And buddies of theirs, who weren't the government, but it was a bank affiliated with the government, gave them another $500 million. And now the Trump Tower project is on and ready. And, of course, Ivanka Trump, pretty much the same day, got 14 trademarks that are going to be worth $200 million to her over the next few years. And so, boom, suddenly it's like, we're all about Chinese jobs, And he's like, whoa, that's so corrupt. And I'm like, yeah, this is, he says, is that legal? And I said, I think in the most technical sense, no, but it is something that is being done now, and the ground, again, was laid for this by our Supreme Court's interpretation of what free speech means. And so, once again, not only can corporations buy politicians, not only can politicians own their own, billionaires, own their own politicians, but now, Xi Jinping can own Donald Trump. Easy enough. So, it's pretty grim. And we actually went through a series of examples of this kind of stuff, and every time it came back to that, and he's like, so that's why DC has grown so much and no place else in America is, and I'm like, yeah, the best investment you can make in America right now is to buy a politician. I mean, if you're a giant pesticide company or, whatever, and you don't want something to be listed as cancer-causing, buy a couple dozen, maybe 100 politicians. Might cost you a few $1 million, might even cost you a few tens of millions of dollars. But you'll save a, $10, $20 billion product. And this is like happening right across the board. We're still subsidizing oil to the tune of $100 billion a year. We're whacking now solar. People are losing jobs in the solar industry. So, under this rubric of trade and the imperial presidency, as it were, Trump is really showing us now, and I suppose we should be grateful for this, he's really showing us now the ultimate logical consequence of this insanity that those of you who do deep dives into this stuff know really started at the beginning of the Republic and got picked up with the Dartmouth case and from there forward. But for people who are just kind of skipping the surface at the very least, the phony baloney BS head note on the 1886 Santa Clara case, and the Supreme Court citing that 30 some odd times, and then we get to 76 and Buckley, and there's obviously been a lot of stuff in between, and then Citizens United and McCutcheon, which basically said billionaires can own as many politicians as they want, it doesn't matter. So I think that the reason, I think that the question that Caitlin poses is what's most critical for the US democracy movement to be doing right now? And it is so obvious, it should be so obvious, I mean, I know it's obvious to all of you, but it should be, or it's increasingly becoming obvious to American citizens that money has corrupted our political system, and that corporations claiming that they have rights under the Constitution has corrupted our political system, and that if we can oh, and this was another question that my cab driver said. He was like, I know, he says, I know Nigeria's like this, and actually there's a pretty strong democracy movement in my country right now, but very often they get killed. He said, what about the other big countries around the world? And I said, well, setting aside China and Russia, I think we're pretty much the only major economy and democracy that so clearly, explicitly, and openly allows corporations and billionaires to own their very own politicians, to write their own legislation. I mean, the outrage of ALEC, for example, twice a year, 1-to-1 ratio of lobbyists to legislators sitting in the room having discussions about all these individual topics, whether it's big pharma or whether it's big oil or whether it's whatever it may be. That, to the best of my knowledge, and I lived overseas for a year, and I'm fairly familiar with other European democracies. To the best of my knowledge, we're the only ones that have really at least gone down that road that far. Now, others, unfortunately, are moving in that direction. As I point out in my book, Unequal Protection, back when South Africa became a modern republic, AT&T, as I recall, volunteered a couple of their lawyers to go over and help them write their constitution, and wrote into it a provision acknowledging corporate personhood. So, there's a long way to go and a lot of work to do. But the most critical thing, in my opinion, that we can be doing right now is elevating this issue of money in politics and working to get money out of politics. And obviously, I believe that the best way to do that is to amend the Constitution to go around the Supreme Court. I mean, there are a number of other ways to do it that probably you've been discussing over the last couple of days. They're all good. I think all of them, at least all the ones I know of, are just far less likely to happen over the near term. And the one thing that I would remind you is, those of you old enough to remember the late 60s, early 70s, Barry McGuire had this song, The Eve of Destruction. Remember that? And there was a line in that song that said, you're old enough to kill, but not for voting. And the 5th Amendment, I think, 26th, whatever, I think it's the 25th Amendment, was proposed in March of that year. Barry McGuire's song was at the top of the charts, and it was ratified in, August of that year or something like that? I mean, it was like one of the fastest ratifications of a constitutional amendment in the history of the United States, allowing 18-year-olds to vote, because there was a national consensus. Once you get that national consensus, I mean, there's the 27th Amendment, I think it is, that says that members of Congress can't raise their own salaries in their own congressional cycle, it can only take effect in the next one. It was literally written in the 1700s. In fact, I think it might have been written, during the very first Congress, and it just, got passed some decades ago. So typically, constitutional amendments are not easy, but if you can galvanize the people, if you can get the word out, and this might even be a fruitful area for exploration in terms of outreach, because I think that Barry McGuire's and his song, even though he was not a political activist, he was a political activist, but I mean, he wasn't like going from town to town talking about the 18-year-old vote. He was going from town to town singing his song. But getting artists in on this and finding that edge where we can apply it, I think that that's the most important thing. Move to Amend's most important contribution to the movement, in my opinion, is highlighting this in a way that's accessible to average people on the one hand, and Move to Amend does a marvelous job of that on their website and in their materials. Average people who are not attorneys can read this stuff and get it. And, oh, yeah, okay, this is how it happened. If you want the deep dive, it's there. If you want the really deep dive, it's here. And, that's available to people too. So Move to Amend, unlike many organizations that either just deal with the surface stuff or just deal with the way deep down in the weeds and, the general public not invited, Move to Amend has filled that entire arc. And I'm very proud of that. I'm very pleased about that. I don't have the right to be proud about it. I didn't do the work, you all did. But I think it's just an extraordinary thing, and I think that Move to Amend, and I say this on the radio frequently, is one of the most important of the, not just because the issue is, I think, the most important, but largely. But I think that Move to Amend is one of the most important organizations in the United States working right now to, I'm not even sure I can say restore democracy, because if you look at the whole arc of history of this country, we've been pretty damn undemocratic, and we continue to be. I mean, it's how you can get a guy who got 3 million fewer votes in the White House, because, we had to protect the slave states, right, with the Electoral College. But, if the language is acceptable to restore democracy to America, if not, let's try it, It's like that old Winston Churchill quote. So those are my thoughts on that, and once again, I just want to honor you for being here. I'm pleased to be here. Caitlin calls and says, "Will you be someplace?" I'll be there. But you guys are doing some really great and important work. Thank you for being here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jazmin Gomez. By day, I am a lawyer and a Democracy Honors Fellow at Free Speech for People. And at Free Speech for People, I specifically work on passing a constitutional amendment to get big money out of politics and corporate personhood and promote political equality. But also, by night, I do a lot of community organizing. I'm a big community organizer, and I fight for queer and trans liberation, promoting racial equality and racial equity, and also just to decolonize Puerto Rico. And so I'm also queer, I'm Puerto Rican, I grew up low income, and I'm still swimming in lots of debt. And I say these other aspects of my identity because they greatly influence the work that I do, both during my day job and in my activism. And so when I think of why we need to abolish corporate personhood and corporate dominance in general, I'm always considering how these issues affect those who are most marginalized by systems of oppression. So Free Speech for People recently worked on 2 separate reports around corporate personhood and corporate dominance, and I want to talk about both of them here. So one of the reports is called Contaminating the Courts, and that was done in collaboration with Greenpeace. And so that report explains the history of corporate constitutional rights, because as many of us know, corporate constitutional rights did not start with Citizens United, but started long, long, long ago. Also, the report then goes into how these corporate constitutional rights are harming our environment. The other report is a report that I specifically worked on, and we don't have a name for it yet because it has not yet been released, but it goes through the history of political inequality and corporate dominance in Puerto Rico, and it also analyzes the impacts that money and politics has on the financial crisis and the recovery of that, as well as the recovery of Hurricane Maria. So while this report hasn't yet been released, I am going to be giving you all a first preview of it today. So I want to start with Contaminating the Courts, and that's mainly because it gives this history of corporate personhood, and I know many of you probably already understand that history and know it, but for folks watching online, for folks who are new here, I kind of just want to go through it a little bit. So why does it even matter when corporations claim constitutional rights. Constitutional rights, they're areas of our lives that we deem to be so fundamental that to our liberty that the government can't control it without a really, really compelling interest and without it being super narrowly tailored. And so what that means is when artificial entities, like a corporation, makes a claim that it should have a constitutional right, that in turn ends up invalidating legislation that we have passed to protect people, to protect the environment. So the start of corporations and the start of this country was really different. Corporations, when we began the country, were really rare. And to protect against corporate overreach, there were state charters that really restricted both the activities corporations could do and how long corporations would be able to sustain themselves for. The drafters of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, while might not always be the most important people, have also been very clear about how they feel on corporations. Thomas Jefferson said that he wanted to crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations which dare already challenge our government to a trial of the strength. Even the courts, the Supreme Court at this time, knew that corporations shouldn't be giving constitutional rights. And to be fair, they weren't giving constitutional rights to a lot of people at this time, and not people. But in 1839, Justice Black stated, the only rights a corporation can claim are rights which are given to it by its charter, not the rights that belong to the members as citizens of a state. However, the Gilded Era changed everything. After the Civil War, the United States ended up passing the 14th Amendment, which a lot of us know here, extended equal treatment to all Black and non-white people in the United States. And in 1886, there was a case called Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. So in that case, Southern Pacific Railroad tried to avoid taxes by claiming that it was a person protected under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So the court actually ended up siding with the Southern Pacific, but on grounds of state law, not corporate personhood. However, they decided, and it's really strange that they do this because really courts try to limit their opinion as much as possible. But in the beginning of the opinion, they said, the court does not wish to hear the argument on the question of whether the provision of the 14th Amendment applies, which forbids the state to deny any person, very specifically person, within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law to these corporations. We are all of the opinion that it does. So without giving any explanation as to why, the courts just said in that moment, yeah, corporations are people. So what happened? Corporate lawyers, judges, they all began to cite this Santa Clara decision, and that began fabricating these corporate constitutional claims. And by 1938, the Supreme Court saw how the 14th Amendment was a tool to sustain power and to build corporate dominance. The Supreme Court stated, of the cases in the court in which the 14th Amendment was applied during the first 50 years of its adaptation, so we're looking at the first 50 years after the 14th Amendment was applied, less than 0.5% was invoked for the protection of Black people. More than 50% asked that its benefits be extended to corporations. So immediately, corporations seized this opportunity, jumped in the courts, and tried to maintain their own dominance. Eventually, due to Roosevelt's threat to increase the Supreme Court size, corporate constitutional rights began to be more limited. And so we have this up and down throughout history. It wasn't until the infamous Powell memo in the 1970s, and I'm not sure if you all know of this, but Justice Powell wrote a memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce saying that corporations were under attack and we had to do something about it. And then he later became a Supreme Court justice and decided many of the corporate rights cases. But from the 70s until today, we've seen a dramatic increase in corporations claiming that they have constitutional rights. So I want to give you two examples from this report, Contaminating the Courts, and I wish I could give you more, but I want to save time so we could also talk about the Puerto Rico piece. But if you all want to get more information, we actually have excerpts of the executive summary on that desk back there, and within those excerpts you can also find where to get the actual report itself. And it really goes deep into a lot of the constitutional law, which could be helpful for lobbying, and also if your lobbyists care about environmental issues, this might be a good opportunity to show how corporate rights affects those issues. But an example is Noel versus the Board of Election Commissioners. And this is an example of corporations using the 14th Amendment again today. So in 2014, St. Louis residents, they were concerned about the negative impacts both on the environment and with their economy with relation to unsustainable energy production, fossil fuel companies. So they ended up gathering enough signatures to put a ballot initiative forward that would have prevented the city from giving tax breaks to companies that were unsustainable energy, so like these fossil fuel companies and any of their business partners. Before the ballots were even printed, and it's a really hard feat, I know a lot of you probably know, to get enough signatures to get a ballot initiative moving forward. Before it was even printed, fossil fuel companies, citizens, presumed to be fronting for the St. Louis-based coal giant Peabody Energy, ended up suing. And they sued to dismantle the ballot initiative, and they cited Rover v. Evans. And this is a court case that extended basic protections to LGBTQ folks. So the energy company then, in essence, argued that limiting its ability to get corporate tax benefits was no different than discrimination against an oppressed sexual orientation. So at trial, the coal company's lawyers suggested that the real motivation for this was a general hostility to corporations and capitalism in general, and then more specifically, hostility towards Peabody Energy. And the state court agreed and held that, citing both Citizens United and Rover v. Emmons, business organizations are persons entitled to equal protection as well as other constitutional rights, and this was legislation that was meant to fence out selected classes. So then, rather than viewing this initiative as targeted towards economic development and environmental sustainability, he viewed it as an unconstitutional form of discrimination against energy companies and ended up striking it down. So the next case that I want to talk a little bit about is one that's currently happening, and it's with Exxon. So in the end of March 2016, there was a group of attorney generals who announced that they were going to be investigating Exxon's climate change disclosures to see whether or not Exxon misled investors. We had people gotten word that Exxon had science from well long ago that highlighted that the practices that they're enacting harmed the environment, and there's word that that was suppressed, and they got new science instead. And so attorney generals were issuing civil investigative demands and subpoenas so that they can get more information on fraud allegations. But in response, Exxon filed suit against the Massachusetts Attorney General, the New York Attorney General, and the Virgin Islands Attorney General, all claiming that they had their First Amendment right not to speak. And this in turn ended up making the Virgin Islands pull back because they don't have the money to afford these legal battles. So that suit's still currently going on today, and we're going to see where it ends. So those are just some quick examples of how corporate constitutional rights harm the environment. But now I want to switch gears so that I could talk a little bit about this report on Puerto Rico. So since September 2017, over 100,000 people have fled Puerto Rico seeking refuge on the mainland U.S. And recent reports say that almost 4,500 people have died from the impacts of Hurricane Maria. This hurricane left most of the island without electricity, water, or shelter. And Puerto Ricans who were temporarily or permanently displaced from the island coming to the U.S. mainland, they've been cramped in small motels, looking for employment, looking to get food options, and also trying to figure out how to provide their children with education. Now, many of those same Puerto Ricans are finding themselves without a place to live as FEMA waivers for housing and water begin to get cut. So the loss in FEMA waivers is going to put countless Puerto Ricans in a state of limbo. Many of them aren't prepared to go back to the island. Thousands of people on the islands themselves have been waiting for months to repair their home, only to be given plastic roofs. Over 280 public schools have been shut down and remain closed, and electricity is still wholly unreliable. There have been several major power outages that have left much, and in some cases, all of the islands of Puerto Rico without electricity. And what's worse is that Hurricane Maria merely exacerbated these issues. A lot of this turmoil actually began with the financial crisis in Puerto Rico. So in 2016, for example, during the first 20 days of July, 65% of municipalities in Puerto Rico reported blackouts. And so given these circumstances, on May 1st of 2018, thousands of Puerto Ricans gathered together to protest austerity measures. And these measures, these austerity measures, were actually put forward by an unelected financial oversight board that was imposed by Congress that controls all decisions around government spending for Puerto Rico, including social services and debt repayment. So this legislation is known as Promesa. Puerto Ricans protested the school shutdowns, the rolling back of labor protections, privatization of government entities, cutting of pensions, and the level of control that was actually given to Promesa. The protests turned violent as police officers fired pepper spray and tear gas into crowds in response to a group of demonstrators who were attempting to push past the barrier and claims of rocks and water bottles being thrown at them. On May 2nd, the next day, Puerto Ricans took to the streets again. So if so many Puerto Ricans are unhappy about Promesa, then why does this unelected financial oversight board hold so much power? Why is it that after so many months, Puerto Rican people are still without basic utilities? Well, since the US invasion of Puerto Rico, corporate greed and big money have always influenced politics in Puerto Rico. The United States actually originally seized Puerto Rico from Spain, not just to fulfill racist desires of manifest destiny, but also because they wanted to expand influence and control of US-based businesses over new regions, namely the Caribbean. The United States has historically granted special benefits to large corporations moving to Puerto Rico, while simultaneously working to minimize the voice of self-governance of those living on the islands. So I'm just going to give a little bit of history on Puerto Rico, just a really short excerpt to give some context of the history of corporate dominance on the islands. So in July 1898, during the Spanish-American War, the United States invaded and conquered Puerto Rico. And the US maintained a military government in Puerto Rico until the Treaty of Paris was signed later that year. In that treaty, Spain, against its own treaty with Puerto Rico, who had actually won its independence the year prior to that, illegally transferred Puerto Rico and other islands to the United States possessions. So about a year later, 1900, Congress enacted the Foraker Act as a comprehensive measure, and this measure was intended to transform everything in Puerto Rico, the economic, legal, the political foundations. And what it did was establish a temporary civil government in Puerto Rico and gave complete control of that government to US-appointed governor and executive council. And all of those people were non-Puerto Rican white men. So that allowed the US governor, the US-appointed governor, and the executive council to rig the rules of commerce to favor large corporations. And that in turn ended up decimating local sugar businesses that were really fundamental to the economy. And so I want to give an example of that. Without the input of any Puerto Rican people, the first US civilian governor, Charles Herbert Allen, ended up creating a budget for the entire islands of Puerto Rico. That new budget stopped repairing and stopped all school construction funds, and instead ended up generating hundreds of new political appointees, which he then filled. He also then redirected insular budget funds to issue no-bid contracts, so just straight-up government contracts to US businessmen, including his own father, Lumber. Allen wrote in his first annual report to the US president about the profits that could come from Puerto Rico. He wrote how the fresh blood of Anglo-Saxon people was needed because Puerto Rican people would not be able to manage their own affairs. This was a common view at the time. For example, in 1901, the Supreme Court actually said that Puerto Ricans were an alien race who could not understand Anglo-Saxon principles, and therefore the United States Constitution and its protections did not fully apply to people on the island or the island itself. So a few weeks after he issued this report highlighting all of these things, a few weeks after he appointed all of the political appointees that he wanted to, he actually resigned as governor and went and joined Wall Street. There he became the vice president of Morgan Trust Company and another trust company in New York. His political appointees, who were still in Puerto Rico, ended up giving generous land grants, tax subsidies, water rights, railroad easements, foreclosure sales, and favorable tariffs to white Americans who were coming in for the sugar industry. And that allowed Allen's private syndicate, a syndicate that he owned, to actually end up controlling 98% of the sugar produced for the United States by 1907, so like 6 years. That company still exists today, and it's known as Domino Sugar. So this is just one example of the history of corporate dominance and political inequality that exists in Puerto Rico. But that report that I've created, actually ends up continuing to follow policies in Puerto Rico enacted by Congress. It follows the Jones-Forth Act, the Merchant Marine Act, Puerto Rican protests and gag laws, Operation Bootstraps, predatory lending by big banks, all the way to the financial crisis itself. Then the report analyzes the way that Congress responds to the financial crisis and the hurricane. And I'm just going to take a couple more minutes to just give an example of how some of the ways that Congress considered addressing the financial crisis in Puerto Rico. So there were three main categories of proposals on how to deal with the debt that was happening in Puerto Rico. And to understand the incentives for these proposals, it's important that we both understand a little bit more background on the debt and the Puerto Rican Constitution. So the Puerto Rican Constitution didn't even come into play until 1952, and even that document itself is incredibly limited, and I talk much more about that in the report. But the Puerto Rican Constitution ended up creating limits for how much debt Puerto Rico could accrue. So the Puerto Rican government has two forms of bonds that are happening. They have a general obligation bonds, and then they have these sales bonds. They're called COFINA bonds. In addition to setting limits on the debt, the Puerto Rican Constitution only guaranteed the repayment of the general obligation bonds. Despite this, billions of dollars worth of COFINA bonds were created and sold by Wall Street and the Puerto Rican government. And again, I go into detail on that in the report. But since the start of the financial crisis, there have been countless Puerto Ricans and around Puerto Rico and around the United States who have been protesting. They've been protesting, demanding that the debt be forgiven in full because it was in violation of the Puerto Rican Constitution, and it was unethical due to the astronomically high predatory interest rates and the history of U.S. history involvement destroying the local economy and facilitating the economic crisis itself. So Puerto Ricans are like, you all did this, some Puerto Ricans on the island, you all did this, we want the debt to be forgiven, this isn't even something that we had control over. That didn't ever get moved forward by Congress in any capacity. Another proposal would allow Puerto Rico to file for bankruptcy under Chapter 9, which is the Insolvent Governments Clause of the Bankruptcy Code. So after Congress encouraged purchases of Puerto Rican bonds through triple tax exemptions, which again, I get into that in the report itself, it ended up that by 1940, Puerto Rican debt became super widely held by a multitude of institutions and individuals and municipalities. In 1984, Congress amended the bankruptcy code so that it didn't actually apply to Puerto Rico. And that was because it was able to give control, the ultimate control around debt repayment to Congress. So at the time, there were various institutions that held either these general obligation bonds or these COFINA bonds. If Chapter 9 bankruptcy proceedings were to occur, the creditors that held debt consistent with the Puerto Rican Constitution, general obligation bonds under the debt limit, would be the people who'd get the first opportunity for debt repayment. So that led to an uprise of people resisting who owned COFINA bonds. So this idea of Chapter 9 bankruptcy proceedings led to resistance both in the courts and in Congress. So in the courts, there are two large mutual fund companies, and those folks are folks who mostly own the COFINA bonds, and they ended up suing the Puerto Rican government because the Puerto Rican government in 2014 ended up passing local legislation that would have allowed for bankruptcy proceedings to happen in Puerto Rico for its own utilities company. So it just wanted to be able to deal with bankruptcy for its utilities company. And immediately, corporations came in and they were like, no, you can't do that. And the Supreme Court agreed and sided with the mutual fund companies, and it claimed that only Congress can have the bankruptcy laws. So then, those hedge fund groups went to Congress. There was multiple hedge fund and financial institutions that lobbied Congress against allowing bankruptcy proceedings. And for an example, there's a hedge fund group called Blue Mountain, and they ended up circulating a letter to all of these lawmakers, telling them not to support the bankruptcy provisions, because they were fearful that allowing bankruptcy would cause public worker pension payments to be prioritized over bondholders, and they didn't want that. So, an example, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, some of you all will be talking to him on Monday, and 2016 presidential candidate, once actually had staffers who were involved in drafting a bill that would have allowed for Puerto Rico to file for bankruptcy. 3 weeks after a hedge fund founder held a presidential fundraiser for Rubio, he quickly shifted his position and said that bankruptcy should only be a last resort effort. That, however, is not to say that the elected officials that were advocating for debt restructure options like bankruptcy always had the Puerto Rican people in mind. Because remember, a lot of Puerto Rican people were advocating for debt forgiveness. In fact, because so many investment firms actually bought these triple tax exempt bonds, legislation that would allow for debt restructuring like bankruptcy would benefit certain firms too. So you had a bunch of different investment firms over here who also supported Chapter 9 bankruptcy, and they ended up donating over $325,000 to politicians both on the left and the right in 2015. And the politician who actually received the most money from these investment firms was Representative Chuck Schumer of New York. And Chuck Schumer is a member of the Finance and Judiciary Committee, so he has a lot of control over policies that would affect Puerto Rico. The legislation that actually ended up getting passed in Congress is known as PROMESA, which is what we spoke about earlier, the unelected advisory board who proposed austerity measures that Puerto Ricans were protesting. This board, talked about much more in detail in the report, has extreme conflicts of interest and allows corporations to basically take direct control of their ability to be paid, while so many Puerto Rican people are suffering. So to read more about that report, please either contact me or you can sign up at the back. There's going to be like a sign-up sheet that's just for the Puerto Rico document. There's also a sign-up sheet for Free Speech for People, and we don't do as much of the grassroots work like Move to Amend, but what we do is create educational materials that can hopefully help you all with the advocacy that you're doing. And so we also have a one-pager back there, front and back, with money and politics and summaries for those contaminating the court reports. So that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, there we go. I think this one's okay. Thank you, though. To get into a little bit of discussion specifically, also wanted to give each of them a chance if there was anything they wanted to respond. Our questions are a little bit out of order, so it sort of is just like all the things on the table that we want to be talking about are why we need to abolish corporate personhood to save democracy on our planet, and then specifically, what do we think is most critical for the U.S. democracy movement to be doing right now, and specifically Move to Amend's most important contributions, and how we can do our part as an organization more effectively. Since this is also meant to be not just a training conference, but a strategy conference, and so we wanted to ask these folks their input on all of that. So first of all, is there anything that either of you want to respond to it or add to in terms of what the other one said? Anything additional that's come to mind? No, that's okay.
I talked about.
Oh, your mic isn't on, sorry. There we go, thanks.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, there we go. I talked about saving democracy, and I mentioned Monsanto implicitly. I think saving the planet is hand in hand with this. You know, it's fairly self-evident that the planet is being destroyed by capitalism run amok, frankly. And you know, the answer isn't necessarily Marxism, although Marx had a really good critique of capitalism. But clearly, given the system we have, that is not going to change next week. If we want to stop runaway climate change, which could render our species extinct, more likely, in my opinion, simply destroy civilization, and you know, cut the human population on the planet down to a few 100 million people. If we want to avoid that kind of an outcome, which may well be right now in our grandchildren's lifetimes, we have to act. And the principal force against which we are acting are corporations claiming the rights of persons under the Constitution and in the courts, and using those rights now to stack the courts with people like Neil Gorsuch, to stack the political deck, as it were, you know, to stack the federal regulatory agencies. I mean, Scott Pruitt, Ryan Zinke, these guys are the poster boys for the kind of corruption. Betsy DeVos, education, although that's less consequential in terms of global warming. I would argue that if we don't have an educated populace, it's incredibly consequential. You know, so I could go on. I mean, the list is long, and I think it's fairly self-evident that this is key work. This is you know, this is not. We're not floating around the top here. This is like getting right down to the root of the tree, getting right down to the guts of the thing, and dealing with the genuine, serious problem.
Yeah, the one thing that struck me while you were talking is that, I mean, we literally have a corporation in the presidency. I mean, yes, there's a human being, but Trump's whole thing is his corporation. And so we have, and as a result, he has filled every single element of government that he has a say over with other corporate friends. And also, we have this rise of white supremacy and fascism that's kind of coming along with that, because those two things are very tied together.
Systems.
Exactly. Yeah. So, so then, and Thom already spoke to this some, but if there's anything you want to add and want to give Jasmine a chance to add to the questions of what do you think is most critical for the U.S. democracy movement to be doing right now, and then specifically move to amends contributions to that.
I riffed on that already.
Yeah.
So, hello.
Yeah, you can hold it in your hand if that feels better.
Yeah, I think so. So I think that the most important thing that we could be doing right now is bringing an intersectional lens to the democracy movement work. And when I say that, what I mean is not just including people who have been marginalized by systems of oppression, which is really important and a necessary thing to do, but also to discuss the actual systems of oppression that relate to those individuals and how they interrelate with issues of money and politics and corporate personhood, and how money and politics and corporate personhood are actually tools to sustain different types of systemic abuse that's been happening basically since the beginning of our society. And so I think that there's like a lot of really amazing ways that we could do that, including educating ourselves on the history of oppression of different communities, including centering people who've been marginalized by systems of oppression in events or in reports, so that we can see how these issues affect them and their communities, and also just building solidarity, responding to issues that both groups are working on and building together. And the reason why I think it's so important, and just to give folks a heads up, I will be talking about all of this, but in more depth tomorrow during the conversation on building solidarity. But there's two really main reasons why I think it's really important that we do this type of work. One very simple. We're missing invaluable, beautiful voices and people. And I mean, we could look around the room right now, and I'm pretty sure besides the people working, I might be one of the only people of color here and one of the only women of color here. And so we're missing out on voices for sure. And also with relation to that is that when we end up centering those who have been most harmed by systems of oppression and therefore most harmed by money and politics and issues of money and politics, then we could actually end up addressing some really amazing, deep and systemic changes that need to happen to promote true political equality for everybody. And so again, I'll get more into depth with all of this tomorrow. But when I came into this space, I realized that in addition to not a lot of people looking like me here, a lot of the conversation around money and politics centered on court cases and the amount of money spent on elections and all of these things that are really up here, and that's important, and it's valuable that we talk about those things, but also how does it relate to individual people? And I think that, really, if we're talking about how these issues interrelate with other systems of oppression, we can get at the crux of, why people are experiencing things the way they do and how they're experiencing those things. But again, I'll talk about all of this tomorrow.
Do you want to add to the second one, or is there anything you want to?
Well, I think delivering the simple message, your home value crashed in 2008 because corporations were claiming the rights of people and messed with the system. Your paycheck has not grown in the last 30 years because corporations have been exercising their power to merge and create monopsonies in industry after industry after industry and engage in anti-union practices, all with the help of politicians who are corporate owned. That the administration is arguing before the Supreme Court right now that it's unconstitutional to have a law that says that health insurance companies have to provide you with services, even if you've been paying for your health insurance for 20 years and you get cancer, that they have to actually provide you with that. Or if they find that you had a pre-existing condition, they have to take you. And of course, the Trump administration now is saying, no, let's bring back rescission. Let's bring back pre-existing conditions. These things are unconstitutional, which is just total, forgive my language, bullshit. And, pointing those things out in a very real way at the level of the individual. The reason why your job has moved to China is because a corporation using their corporate personhood powers, asserted the right to move their factories to China, even though you as a person can't move there for that job, but, so, et cetera. I think those are useful.
Yeah, I would just add that, so for the question of what do you think are Move to Amend's most important contributions to the movement? So you all are a very important contribution, and I'm so grateful that you all exist and you're doing this work. But also, in regards and in relation to the need to promote more intersectionality, I think Move to Amend's doing a lot of really beautiful work in this area. So there's the movement education program that affiliates have to go through that really discusses a lot of that history of oppression, which I think is really, really necessary aspect of solidarity building. So it's really, really valuable that exists. These conferences end up highlighting a lot of these issues, which I think is really important so that folks get exposure. We have worked together along with a lot of other organizations to actually center people who have been most marginalized by systems of oppression. And so we work together on panels on how money and politics affects the queer and trans community. And we also work together on a webinar on how to make the pro-democracy movement more intersectional. And with that webinar, we brought in all of these incredible people that work from completely different parts of the field, people who do economic justice, people who do trans liberation, all sorts of folks. So that's a really great webinar that you all can see too to get more information. And then also just the building solidarity efforts. You all do a lot of work with the Movement Council and just generally working with other organizations. So I would say that those are some of the things that you're doing really great.
Is there anything else you want to add, Tom, in terms of direction for us or advice for us that we should be doing to be more effective as an organization?
Keep up the great work you're doing.
Okay, fair enough. We'll try. We did, and this I'll say for everybody in the room, but also the folks who are listening out there, we did just have, we were facing a $150,000 budget shortfall in the beginning of this year, and we just made up for that in May, but we still have to get through the rest of the year. So to all of those folks who think that this is really important work, please make a contribution to Move to Amend so that we can continue to do it. So that's basically our presentation, unless there's anything else that either of you want to add on the bigger question, but we also wanted to provide an opportunity for folks to ask questions, so we will do that. And if there's folks online who have questions, we could also work those into the mix. So Keon, if there is anybody, you can raise your hand and we'll go to you as well. And we do have a good bit of time for that, at least half an hour here. Are you up here because you're doing that? Thank you, Shelley, very much. So just remember that this mic is a lot louder than these mics, so don't hold it up here. Hold it down here, otherwise you'll blast us all. All right, so is there anyone who has any questions for Jasmine or Tom? So you got it.
Daniel.
Daniel could come a little closer.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah-ish.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay. I was wondering, Jasmine, if you could, I don't know if there is a way to make a comparison between PROMESA and then some of the trade deals that we've seen. I only ask because I feel like people can relate to something more when they empathize and they see themselves in their shoes, and I see a lot of connection between the way PROMESA is being imposed on the Puerto Rican people and the intent behind things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and other large trade deals. So if there is a connection that you can make, great. If there's not, just tell me to not.
So I haven't taken a lot of time to think about that specific connection, but this type of unelected financial oversight board doesn't only exist in Puerto Rico. It actually is based off of something that's happening in Flint, Michigan right now. And so in Flint, Michigan, with all of the water crisis and all of these other crises happening, basically the government, the state of Michigan said the local government doesn't have the ability to properly determine its own economic moves moving forward. So they basically gave control over economic policy in Flint, Michigan to this unelected board, which I'm pretty sure, and don't quote me exactly on this, but I'm pretty sure that board's done horrible things in terms of providing Nestle with a bunch of access to water in like the local area, Flint, Michigan, while the folks are still having poison water. And they haven't done anything to really address any of the poison water issues, or they've been working towards it, but it's still poison. So I don't know exactly how it interrelates with the labor movement, although that is something I want to think about moving forward. But this type of board exists here in the United States, in other cities, other municipalities that have been deemed not worthy of being able to control their own economic policies.
And it's grounded in a model that's been used against countries.
So they'll take, Flint had a city council that was elected, but they basically removed that and put a general manager in charge that's appointed by the governor. Emergency general manager. Emergency for a number of years, though, like indefinitely,
Yeah,
right?
Detroit.
So yes, we think that we can vote for elected representatives, but in some places, even in the United States, that's not true. There is a question from online that says, why does Puerto Rico not just become the 51st state of the United States? Do you want to say anything to that?
Congress has to decide that first. The Puerto Rican people have been making votes. Also, the votes that they have been making in relation to this issue oftentimes are like clouded in all of this uncertainty and lies. So like most recently, Puerto Rico voted to become a state, but then like because the whole process was so fictitious feeling for all of the Puerto Rican people who were living on the island, I think like about 1/4 of the people actually voted. And then of those people, then they voted for statehood. But basically, everyone was like, but basically no one voted in Puerto Rico, so that isn't even going to count. But I think a lot of people have resistance around being part of the United States in one aspect because of just like and of course when you read the report, you can really get a deep sense of this, but just the U.S. involvement in Puerto Rico has been something that's been like really hard for a lot of Puerto Rican people, and also unwanted initially. And so I think that some people don't even like the idea of being a 51st state. A lot of people want independence if their debt was forgiven, if all of these other situations happen. But also, every time that there has been votes for it, it's been really corrupted, the entire process. And I think Congress ultimately is the deciding factor, and Congress doesn't seem to want to take on a state that has a lot of debt right now.
I would add, if Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. had the same demographic profile of Wyoming, the Republican Party 50 years ago would have made sure that they were the next two states.
Absolutely. Is there anyone else who has any questions? Yeah.
This is for Thom. I want to thank you for reminding me about the time in the 60s when that amendment was passed. At the time, I would have preferred that the draft age would have been raised to 21 rather than the reverse. But I'm wondering why, at the time, there was such an immediate response and such a fast response to raise or lower the voting age. It was so fast. Right now, there's a very wide awareness and even enthusiasm among both Democrats and Republicans and independents as well to remove the influence of money in our elections, and even to pass an amendment to do that. Why isn't that happening? Why isn't there such an immediate response to that?
It's the answers kind of fall into two different buckets. Having lived through the 60s and been a member of Students for Democratic Society and having participated, yeah, you too, and participated in a lot of action, including direct action that landed me in jail more than once. Because of the draft, there was virtually not a family in America who didn't have or know somebody whose child had gone to Vietnam or whose neighbor's child had gone to Vietnam and, in many cases not come back. And everybody was living with that fear. Now we have a volunteer military, which I think is a really bad thing. Volunteer militaries historically are a precursor to military coups and professional militaries. And so the statistic I saw a few weeks ago, and I'm not sure if it's accurate, but it was kind of in passing in an article, I think it was in Harper's, was that only 3% of American families right now have a direct member of their family who's involved in active duty military service. So it's such a tiny fragment of our population that the issues around war and peace don't have the currency that they had 40 years ago. To the second part of the question about why isn't there more of a movement to get money out of politics, I think that the biggest obstacle that we are facing is a media machine which is wholly owned by giant corporations. To some extent this started with Reagan in '87, blowing up the Fairness Doctrine. It got put on steroids in '96 when Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich pushed through and passed the Telecommunications Act with, as I recall, 96 votes in the Senate. these were bipartisan measures, or at least the Telecommunications Act was, that and then the third part of it, I guess, goes back to '83 when Reagan made the decision and directed his Commerce Department to essentially stop enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act, which kicked off a generation of mergers and acquisitions and the whole Michael Milken thing and the whole, they made a movie about that, Wall Street, greed is good, and it hasn't stopped since. Prior to that, it was very difficult for these giant corporations to even come into existence as we know them today in ways where entire industries are dominated by just a few. And so there's every day, it seems, 100 opportunities to discuss the impact of money in politics and the corrupting and corrosive impact of money in influencing how our planet is being destroyed, whether it's via war or toxic chemistry, you name it, inhumane activities, etc. And yet, the media, the pundits in the media, never discuss these things. Cenk Uygur tells this story really well about when he was at MSNBC, and I won't try and repeat it. You can find it on YouTube. Ed Schultz has told the same story at a talkers convention a few years back, which is also out on YouTube. And this is not just a pick on MSNBC, this is right across the board. And I think this is what happened with Dylan Ratigan. He had me on his show once, and we talked about this issue and about the 1886 case and the 76 case and all these other things. And it did not go over well, shall we say, with the suits. So we have the biggest challenge that we have, I think, is cutting through that. People thinking that MSNBC is the most liberal network out there, and this is the basis of truth. And if Russia rigged our election, there should be absolute holy hell to pay, and it's increasingly looking like that was the case. But is that worth excluding all other aspects of our democracy, of our economic crises, of our family crises, of the open identity politics that the Republicans are using? By that I mean, white male identity politics, a phrase that they like to use against us, so I've started using it against them. I was yesterday in New York on a panel with 5 conservatives debating them all at the Talkers Convention, and I used that phrase, and I thought their heads were going to explode. Republican identity politics. What? Identity politics, that's yours! No. But, maybe they'll, the corporations basically will let us talk about race because it doesn't cost them any money anymore. They will let us talk about immigration because kind of that cat's out of the bag. They've squeezed pretty much all the money out of cheap labor that they're going to get. They'll let us talk. I mean, there are certain discussions that are acceptable, but anything that has to do with a real discussion of net neutrality, you're not going to hear on any of the big networks because these are the companies that are actually sued to stop net neutrality. It goes away tomorrow morning, by the way, or tonight at midnight. You're not going to hear a serious discussion about war and peace. You're not going to hear a serious discussion about Gaza. You're not going to hear a serious discussion about what is happening right now as we speak in Puerto Rico. You're not going to hear a serious discussion about why refugees, not people looking for a better paycheck, refugees are showing up on our southern border. Where did these people come from? What are the forces that caused them to become in need of refuge? You're not going to hear any serious discussion about any of that because those are all things that actually diminish corporate profits. So instead, it always has to be in this acceptable corporate frame. If we're going to talk about the refugees, we're going to talk about them in a way that would support the idea of building more corporate prisons, more detention centers, more holding centers like the one in Brownsville that Jeff Merkley tried to get into last week and came on my program afterwards and said it was, they're keeping kids in dog kennels and cages like you see in the ASPCA. And Only it's not even one dog per kennel, or it's one kid per cage. It's multiple kids per cage. And this is a privately run facility, right? It's a contractor. So this giant racket has been set up. And then I would finally add, there's a website called theyrule.net, THEYRULE, theyrule.net. And it's a really cool website. It's been around for a while. And on that website, they've got the Fortune 100 companies, but you can also plug in other companies. You can scroll through the list of the Fortune 100 and say, click on AT&T. And so it'll throw up AT&T and it'll show you a little circle around it. Each spoke leads to one of the members of the board of directors, and with their name and their gender. And if they are on multiple boards, they look like a fairly overweight person, and if they're not, they look like a fairly svelte person. And then you pull up, say, Monsanto over here, and it'll show you its board of directors. And then you say, what's the connection between these two? And you discover that, this guy on this board at AT&T is also on the board at Wells Fargo. And this person on the board at Wells Fargo is also on the board at Disney. And this person on the board at Disney is also on the board at Monsanto. And in unequal protection, I went through all 100 companies. They're listed right there. It's about a page-and-a-half long list. And I got it off that website, theyrule.net, so it was current as of about 2000 when I wrote that book. And you can literally connect every single one of the Fortune 100 companies. It's just a giant circle. And so the idea that we even have industries that compete with each other is nonsense. So this is what we're up against, in part.
As questions for Jasmine. So we talked about this a little in private before, and we never got the chance to finish the conversation, which was, I'll kind of change the question a little bit, but you talked a lot about the problems in Puerto Rico over the last 60, 70 years, and my general question to you was, what would you envision as a good destiny or a good direction for Puerto Rico to go in to try to solve some of those problems?
So I can speak from my personal hat and not my professional hat, because at Free Speech for People, we mostly just focus on corporate dominance, corporate constitutional rights, big money in politics, and those issues are the issues that we have like policy decisions on. But personally, I think it's something that the people of Puerto Rico are still working on figuring out. I think it's really important to center Puerto Rican people, not just people living on the island, but people of the diaspora, so people who had to leave the island, especially because people who are no longer on the island are the only people who have the right to vote for a lot of elected representatives. When you're on the island, you can't vote for the President of the United States. You no longer, because of Promesa, can vote for your elected representatives who are dealing with economic issues. And the only person in Congress in Puerto Rico is a non-voting member. So they can introduce legislation, but they can't actually vote on it. So I think that that's an issue that is one that's long-term. People are obviously advocating for the forgiveness of the debt. I think even more so now that the hurricane hit and things have just compounded. And I think that people are also looking for more autonomy. And I don't know what that looks like. I don't know if it's autonomy in the state form and that they'll have their own elected representatives, or autonomy in the sense that they don't want to be part of the United States. But I know that a lot of people right now in this middle area are really unhappy, especially when they saw how the U.S. government could just ignore them during these times of crisis. So I feel like there's like a lot of tension building in the Puerto Rican population. Where is that going to go? I'm not 100% sure. And where should it go? I think, again, that's probably rooted in like the people and what they see to be. And I'm not sure personally where yet I am.
Thom, I wanted to know if there might be a way, you mentioned board of directors, like any kind of partnership with, like, say, the Center for Public Integrity, who does resolutions of, like, lobbying reports and things.
You mean I don't understand your question.
I was just wondering if there would be a way of involving people like on the inside of corporations, like people who are shareholders, to like, might that be a fruitful connection with Move to Amend?
Oh, yeah. With regard to Move to Amend, I don't know. Caitlin, you've not been engaged in shareholder actions, have you?
Not as Move to, well, not really as Move to Amend or otherwise. There was sort of a push for shareholder activism more in the early 2000s, as I think some shareholders were starting to become aware that that might be a platform that they could talk to the power holders directly, whether they already were shareholders or became shareholders, in order to have that venue to engage. So it was sort of a direct action, oftentimes confrontational kind of moment to be at a shareholder meeting and expose what the corporations were doing to the other shareholders. I mean, I think that's something that, in general, we steer away from, not because there might not be potential there, but we're sort of encouraged to act as consumers rather than as full, democratic. I don't want to say the word citizen, but unfortunately we don't have a different word, because not everybody is a citizen who should be fully empowered. So we're either encouraged to like buy stuff or to be shareholders. Shareholders should be the ones who are kind of weighing in on their corporations, and I think that limits the way that we look at power. It sort of is more like we should get together and tell corporations what the proper role is for them to play, and that shouldn't involve a seat at the table for corporations, because corporations are not people. So it's not that necessarily means that a shareholder platform is a bad place to talk about all this, but I think it's really easy for Americans to kind of fall into that of like, let's bring everybody, to the table and kind of figure it out, and it's like, that's because we've been told that corporations should have a seat at the table, instead of thinking about, these are institutions that are economic institutions. They shouldn't be involved in our politics. They shouldn't really be involved in deciding how our economy will operate. They should be told what the rules are, and then they should have to play by the rules. So that's part of just why Move to Amend doesn't engage in that tactic very much. But having said that, at this point, most Americans who have any kind of decent job, which at this point is not most Americans, probably are involved in the stock market in one way or another through retirement. And so I think there's room maybe for us to explore, is there any way for us to assert power that way? And I don't know if with that context there's anything you want to add to answer the question.
No, there was, particularly back in the, even in the 70s, I mean, there was the Catholic nuns, I think it was in the 70s, who were doing shareholder stuff around the war in Vietnam, and then they've been persistent forever. I mean, there's several groups now of nuns who are doing this, but now it's spread, and there is a shareholder activism movement. And occasionally they have a victory, they'll get a scalp here and there, but it tends to be more, taking out a senior executive or a CEO who's a real genuine malefactor. The other problem is it takes a lot of money to do that.
Yeah, that's sort of the thing, is like, not that there's not a place for people with more money, for sure, if they're on board with making shifts. But again, that's kind of the when we're encouraged to kind of think about how to leverage ourselves economically, then that means that, well, if we don't have access to that, then what is the role for us to play? So we sort of more think about it as leverage ourselves in the democracy, because that's actually where we all should get to be.
It's sort of like if the NFL changed the rules so that whichever team had the most money didn't have to make it to the goalpost, they only had to make it to the 30-yard line. And all of a sudden the teams with the most money started winning, and we're all sitting around going, well, gee, maybe we should donate some money to the poorer teams so that they can be the ones who only have to go to the 30-yard line. And and we get caught up in that discussion. Really, the discussion should be, why did the NFL change the rules of the game? I mean, shouldn't the rules of the game be fair? And so that's, I think that it's good and noble work that the people who are really into shareholder activism are doing, and I honor it. But it's operating at the level of the micro, and the thing that I really love about Move to Amend is that it's operating at the level of the macro, at the largest possible frame.
This is for both of you. Most think tanks and news programs I listen to prioritize corporations, how policies are going to affect them, and the very wealthy. And you don't. You prioritize the ordinary people in your reports, in your segments. And my question to you is, why? Thom in particular, and Louise, you talk about Louise a lot, and I think that's great to hear. Both of you are working for regular people, so are you in your reports. So I'm questioning why, because I know you could probably make a lot more money if you, I think, Thom, they would pay you not to even talk anymore. Whatever you want, you could name your asking price. And the same for you. I know you're a lawyer, you can get jobs in these big corporations, make tons of money, pay off all those bills. So my question is, what brought you to this where you're sitting here at a Move to Amend conference instead of some big banquet being celebrated for all you do for the corporations?
For me, I think a lot of it has to do with my identity and with my upbringing. I knew like really early on that things were really unfair. Super early on. Like we grew up making less than $30,000 a year for the whole fam, and nobody in my family really, except for like an aunt here or there, owns houses or assets. And so, you know, it was always, I was the first person in my family to go to college, let alone law school. So basically I continued to see like all of these institutional barriers, access points that other people had that I never had, similar to kind of what you were talking about. And I think that for me at a really young age, I didn't 100% know what I wanted to do to change it, but I know I wanted to change it. And as I went through law school, I got a really deep understanding in critical race theory and restorative justice, other forms of justice, other ways of thinking about how the law is actually perpetuating systems of oppression, created those systems of oppression. And so once I got the language for what was happening in my day-to-day life, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was never ignoring it. I was always working, to address it. But I did try to go to a law firm for a summer, and it wasn't the fit for me. My heart has to be in the work, and the people, is where my heart is. So I think it just stems a lot from my background and who I am.
I've been involved in fighting for justice, for lack of a better word, since I was a teenager. And it's interesting. I was being interviewed 3-4 years ago here in Washington D.C. by a fellow who has a show on one of the right-wing networks. And when we were done with the interview and the mic was off, and this is a guy that he'd been on my program a few times. I know him. I mean, I don't know him like friends, but we've never had a cup of coffee together even, but I know him. How you get to know people when you interact with them a lot. And the camera was off, and we were all alone, just sitting there, as the crew was breaking down all the equipment. And he said, you're a really smart guy. You really know your stuff. He said, if you came over to our side, I could virtually guarantee you'd probably start at around $5 million a year. And I said, well, thanks a lot for the offer. It wasn't obviously an offer, but thanks a lot for the vote of confidence or whatever. But I couldn't live with myself. And I think that this is a struggle that a number of people. I think this is possibly why 2 people just left Scott Pruitt's office. I think it's why people are fleeing the Trump administration. I think it's why they're having a horrible time trying to hire a number 3 for the Justice Department so that when Trump fires Rod Rosenstein, who's number 2, the replacement will be someone he wants, but who has credibility. They can't find them. So I don't think that I'm unique in that regard. I think we all have a moral compass. I think, if anything, the thing that's unique are the people who are willing to sell out. in one of my books. I think it's Rebooting the American Dream. I talked about this remarkable study in Forbes, as I recall. This was maybe 8-10 years ago. And what they found, they were looking at sociopaths, and they found that the number one professions for sociopaths were corporate executives and police officers. And at least in the United States. Now, I lived in Germany for a year, and I can tell you the cops in Germany are not sociopaths. They're decent, by and large, decent people. They're well-paid and well-trained. And Germany has like 1 or 2 police shootings a year. And it's, what, 38 million people, I think? 54 million people is the population of Germany. But in any case, so this light bulb went off for me, which became a chapter when I was in the book Threshold. It became a chapter in that book, which is, why do corporate CEOs make so much money? Right? Why is it that Al Dunlop, when he takes over Sunbeam, and fires 10,000 people and brags about it, is paid, 10, 20, 30 million bucks? Why, I mean, there's no shortage of people, I thought, who for $500,000 a year would fire 10,000 people. You would think, right? And then it hit me that there's a certain skill set that's necessary to be a CEO or senior level executive, and for better or worse, a good chunk of it has to do with who they're born, what social class they're born into, what schools they went to, what their network of friends is, because that's how they got to the launching pad for that position. They then have to have a really, really good intellect, and they have to have a level of training and experience. But all of those things you can hire for less than $1 million. All those things you can hire for a couple $100,000 if you're talking even about just a really difficult job. So why do you have to pay somebody $10 or $20 million a year? Why is it that you have CEOs, and I'm not saying that Stephen Hemsley is a sociopath, but why is it that the CEO of United Healthcare has taken over $1.7 billion in compensation? Excuse me, $1.3 billion. His predecessor, Dollar Bill McGuire, took $1.7 billion, knowing that every penny was because they said to somebody, "No, I'm sorry, your kid can't have that heart surgery." Right? How is it? And that's when the penny dropped for me, that those characteristics that I just described, they're not 100% of they're probably maybe 1% of the population, or 2, or maybe 4 or 5% of the population who have all of those things, and we can debate, whether any of them should be the case. But when you add in that you also have to be truly successful, you have to be a sociopath. In fact, to climb to that level, it's virtually necessary to be a sociopath. Then you've got a very small labor pool. And a very small labor pool means that the price of labor gets bidded up. So I think we're seeing this in real time right in front of us, and we have one of them in the White House, in my opinion.
Well, there's somebody online who asked, how do we hold CEOs and board members personally responsible for their corporation's crimes, which is kind of maybe related to what you're just saying.
Well, this is a really important thing, and I'm guessing you may know more about this than me, but there's this concept, this legal concept, the Latin for it is mens rea, which means arguably state of mind or intention. And right now, if a senior executive, a CEO, board members, whatever, if they make a decision that ends up in somebody dying, whether it's in the factory or it's a consumer or it's whatever, they decide to change how they're going to supply water to Flint or whatever, by law, they can be held accountable for that decision. And it doesn't happen very often. It happened a lot, or somewhat, before the Reagan administration. Reagan kind of put a stop to it. Nobody's really picked it up since, but it's there. And so many of these, in fact, every single one that I've seen, including several bipartisan pieces of legislation that a number of corporate Democrats support, attempt at, quote, prison reform, legal justice reform, criminal justice reform, criminal law reform, every single one of them have built into them just a couple of sentences that say that, that basically blow up that whole mens rea thing, or actually amplify it to the point that if you want to go after the CEO of a corporation who made a decision that led to the death of 5,000 people, you have to, if these guys are successful, you will have to prove that when that person made that decision, they did it with the intent of causing the death of those people, which is almost impossible and is almost never the case. So this is a get out of jail pass for all the white collar criminals in America. And it's, again, something that's never discussed in our media. Occasionally you'll find an in-depth piece in the back pages of New York Times or Harper's. But anyhow, I'm
So we're talking about corporate accountability. You can get corporate accountability through a multitude of ways. Some people want to push it through the courts, kind of similar to what you're talking about, but it's really difficult. It's really difficult for a number of reasons. Some of the reasons you said. Also, when you actually form a corporation, you have almost like this bubble that protects you from liability. And in order to get through that bubble to the actual individual who's making the decisions, you have to pierce the veil. And there's like a whole slew of legal things that needs to happen in order for you to be able to do that. So through the courts, it's like really difficult to hold corporations accountable. There are a lot of grassroots groups who do movements to hold corporations accountable. Move to Amend, Free Speech for People, we work more on shifting the policy rather than corporate behavior, but there are definitely groups. There is a group called Corporate Accountability. They work solely on making sure that corporations are held accountable for their actions. But even with that, it could get tricky because corporations can only do so much themselves. And also, they are protected from, by their actions of doing lots of horrible things because shareholders can sue board member or the corporation if the corporation isn't wholly acting to make as much money as possible. And so we've learned about court cases where if a corporation actively says, we're going to give some of our money so that we can promote equality, and not doing it through a nonprofit, but actually spending their own corporate money on it, shareholders can sue and say, but that's not benefiting me economically. And so this is the other side of shareholder suits that could be really harmful for society. But yeah, so basically it's important to find ways to hold corporations accountable. It's also incredibly difficult to do so. And holding corporations accountable is something that can happen, but also policies need to shift so that corporations don't have the ability to act negligently, horribly, harmfully, etc.
So let's say maybe we have time for 2 more questions. I think I saw 2 hands up that were out there. 3. Well, there's also one online. So if everybody can be concise, we can do all 4. Okay.
Very briefly, we had an exercise this morning here that we all engaged in looking at both threats and opportunities for promoting the democracy movement. Never mind the threats for the moment. How do each of you see, 2 or 3 opportunities to promote democracy, to promote the momentum for democracy in this country?
In just people on the ground? Promote democracy through people on the ground? Okay.
However, yeah. The movement.
So I think it's been really clear that even if we have a conversation about race, before Obama was elected, there was a lot of color blindness. So people white and black people, I don't see the difference, which means that they're not acknowledging some of the systemic issues that are happening to certain communities. But then we've got Obama coming in, and people are like, oh, Obama, there's no racism that exists. So there was this really strong narrative, 2012, et cetera, that racism was on the low. However, Twitter became very available, social media became very available, and people on the ground, specifically black folks, were constantly filming, taking pictures of police doing bad behaviors to them, to their communities. And so now, all of a sudden, you have so much more visual understanding of what certain communities are experiencing, as well as a platform for communities of color who have been historically not really given a lot of access on mass media, to talk about the issues that they're experiencing, now had this ability to create a massive platform. And before Twitter changed its algorithms, it was literally just based on like how many retweets were happening and like how many hashtags were being marked. And so I think that technology is both really scary, especially with net neutrality potentially going away. But it also has a lot of really beautiful, and big data makes it really scary too, but it also has a lot of really beautiful aspects that allow people to see each other more and to come together more and to communicate their feelings and their thoughts and be heard. And so I think honestly, like, technology is something that is inspirational for me in terms of how are we using technology to benefit our movement and move forward with it.
Tell all your friends and have them tell their friends.
Shelley, you got, okay.
My question is the flip side of Greg's question. Right now, there's not a big media concern about move to amend or ending corporate personhood in any serious way. And if I'm wrong about that, you can correct me, but I'm curious about what you would envision being the case once traction kicks in. If you being in the media, especially Thom and Jasmine, your experience, I guess, from a legal side, but that's my question. What if you've thought about that? If you haven't, that's fine. But what you would envision being some of the challenges that the mainstream media, corporate owned, we'd be struggling with from that perspective, and possibly otherwise.
I think, I spoke earlier about these, and so I think many of them are self-evident. And I don't mean to blow off the question. I mean, it's just, they're legion. But I would like to give you a ray of hope, if I may, in the context of your question. The 7 years that I lived here in Washington, D.C., I went to cocktail parties with Grover Norquist and had Republican members of Congress on my program, and I sit with these people over dinner, and I got to know a lot of people who I would never normally hang out with. And on a number of occasions, I have talked with Republican elected officials, with a single exception, all of them members of the House of Representatives. But at least 5, and maybe more. And to a person, they have told me that the largest frustration of their job is having to spend 4 hours a day fundraising. I'm telling you, if we can push this thing out to the point where some sort of a critical mass begins to emerge, and there is a strong move to clean up money in politics, the Republicans are going to yell and scream about it at the surface. But when it comes to a vote, they're going to turn their backs. If they think they can win, they will turn their backs on the Koch brothers. They will turn their backs on the billionaires who own them, because they're as sick of it as the rest of us are. I mean, there's a few of them who are just plain old flat out grifters, but I don't think most of them are. And so that gives me tremendous hope, actually, for what it's worth.
Hello, this is for Thom. Thank you for coming. And you've been in the media industry for a very long time. And just now, one of the biggest problems you already mentioned, that the 18 age limit got passed because everybody knew about it. And just now, we can't tell the public because the corporations own the media. What is your dream? How can we today, with the current situation, create a media that is united and start expressing and conveying this to the population? How can we do that? I want like specifics from your knowledge, because we don't have that knowledge.
We have to re-atomize, break up, fracture the corporate media. I mean, it's just that simple. This has to be done in every industry. But if we're ever going to get honest media again, that's what we have to do. In Russia, in the Soviet Union, when it was the Soviet Union, there were two news agencies, TASS and Pravda. TASS means news, and Pravda means truth, if I'm recalling them correctly. And the joke that every Russian knew was there's no TASS and Pravda, there's no Pravda and TASS. That's the situation we now have found ourselves with. We have opinion journalism, we have very little actual news, all these kind of things. So I think that, but the problem is that, again, this is kind of in the micro level, back to your question. Until we get money out of politics, those monopsony corporations, those monopolistic corporations, are going to use their money to fight any effort to break them up.
So there is no think outside the box means of creating a media that will be as effective as the corporation as of now.
I think America would love to hear from the modern day, Senator Taft from Ohio, Senator Sherman, the Sherman Antitrust Act. I think America would love to hear a modern day Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, by the way. The problem is that the people who speak like that, for example, Howard Dean was on his path to the Democratic nomination. And those of you who were listening to my program back in that time, and this was the 2008 election, as I recall? I'm pretty sure it was. Yeah, and I mean, he was on a roll. And he was on a television program that I don't want to name because I've already antagonized that network, I think, enough today. And Louise and I were sitting there watching TV, watching this happen. It was in the evening news or the evening comment, the primetime comment shows. And this guy said, well, what should we do about the media? Well, it was Chris Matthews. I mean, what the hell? And Howard Dean says, we should break it up. And Matthews says, what, break up the media? And Howard Dean said, yeah, of course. And he said, you realize, NBC is a giant corporation. Are you saying we should be broken up? And Howard Dean was like, yeah. And I turned to Louise and I said, he's screwed. Actually, I used a little stronger word. And 3 days later, the Dean Scream happened. And as you know, the Dean Scream was not, Howard Dean didn't think he was screaming. Nobody in the room thought he was screaming. He was holding a microphone in his hand, and the media took the audio from that microphone and potted down the crowd noise and brought up his noise and made it sound like he was a crazy man. They took him out. And, and I went on the air and called it out. But these are the kind of forces that politicians are dealing with. Congressman Mark Pocan's on my program every week for an hour, takes unscreened calls from listeners asking anything they want of the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And he said last week or the week before last that the biggest challenge he has is getting on the media. They do all kinds of stuff. They have almost daily press conferences. They're introducing legislation every single day. They're putting together plans and programs. Some of this stuff is very real and very powerful. Some of it will have a huge impact. Media will not show up. They will not invite him on the programs unless he wants to talk about Russia. Period.
One of the things we could do is support Free Speech TV. That is helping make it possible for those who are not in the room to be part of this conversation, and also that make Thom's show accessible. And so we're going to end on a question from somebody who is not in the room but is with us online. How do you feel about having about folks going on general strike to force oligarchs to step down and loosen their hold on our political systems?
I am for all sorts of grassroots movements that are going to address power dynamics in society. So I think general strikes are great opportunity.
Amen. It would have worked better 40 years ago when most people in the United States had some level of economic security and didn't have their back to the wall, and when students had no debt. So it's a little more difficult now. There's a lot of people who don't have the luxury of being able to engage in a general strike. But I absolutely agree with Jasmine's sentiment.
All right. Well, we will continue to think about everything that they have given us. And for folks who are online, if you have additional thoughts, we'll continue to monitor the comments and respond to everything like we always do. We're one of the, I think, very few national organizations that actually responds to every single email that we receive, unless it's hate mail and sometimes. But so you feel free to engage with us and to continue to engage with us. But thank you all for your good questions and comments, and most especially thank you to both of you for being here with us tonight and for all your support and partnership that you have given to Move to Amend for years now, and looking forward to continuing our friendship, of course, until we get this done. Thank you, everybody.